Hello and welcome to Pleasure Morsels. This is Susie Showers, and I am running this project as a personal exploration of how to access pleasure beyond the normative scripts. So we are remapping the definition and the experience of pleasure. And I am really thrilled to have my co-conspirator and colleague, Dani Minuskin, here. Dani is an artist, an art therapist, and a counselor. And her practice integrates somatically rooted art therapy with trauma-informed care, nervous system regulation, and mindfulness. Dani is a queer practitioner, and she works in private practice with LGBTQ2SIAA+ adults, yes, who have had difficult life experiences and are looking to reconnect with themselves. Thank you so much for coming out and also wearing the vest.
Yes, I'm happy to match with you.
I am also wearing a vest. We are queers and vests in the fall.
Perfect.
Yeah, so we'll jump right in. This is a morsel, right? So it's short and it's sweet. So my first question is, what can the creative arts do to help people feel into their pleasure?
Yes, and as I saw this question before, and I was like, oh, I feel like so pure art therapy in a sense because I don't incorporate the other creative arts therapy. So I'll talk about visual art therapy and what that looks like in my practice in terms of accessing pleasure. I don't work specifically with sex, so it's more about like accessing pleasure and joy and creativity and compassion and kind of putting all that together in a sense in safety. And so what that looks like for in my practice in terms of like somatic work of where we practice embodying the sensations that show up. So embodying as largely embodying discomfort comes first because that's why people are coming into therapy because they're worried about something. There's things that are bothering them, so they embody discomfort first. And through art therapy, they can externalize it. They can dialogue with it. They can get in touch with it. They can find ways to like tolerate it. And I think through holding space for tension or anxiety or insecurities or all of that stuff that shows up, you can find space for pleasure too and figure out what those tense parts of you need or what those anxious parts of you need in order to feel safer, in order to find joy and compassion. And so that looks like through art making, kind of creating space for that through art making and giving the image sometimes what it needs. And then reflecting that in the body, like what does that feel like when you give those tense parts of you what they need through art making. I love bilateral drawing for this too, because bilateral drawing is we take like a really big piece of paper and we tape it to a table and we use two hands. We're going to do this in Embodying Desire in the group.
You mean in our somatic art therapy group that
we're
we're
going to do
running
this
next
in the group.
month? We're going to be doing bilateral drawing. Okay, I'm stoked.
So bilateral drawing is drawing with two hands. And in my one-on-one sessions, I guide it. And the idea is sort of to reflect what's going on in the body, what's really alive in your body through drawing. And so it looks like noticing what parts of you are feeling tense, noticing whatever sensations are showing up now, and drawing the rhythm of those sensations or like following the impulse of those sensations on the page. I like it because it really helps like bypass the intellect because you're using two hands and you just kind of get into it and it's very somatic. We have a big piece of paper, so you're doing whatever you need to with your whole body. But you notice quickly what feels safe in terms of like how much space you take up on the page. So let's say somebody is taking up a really small amount of space and that feels really safe for them at that time. So maybe that looks like drawing really close to you, even though you have a big space, drawing really close to you. And so I might prompt, like, what does it feel like to go a little bit further? And so accessing a little bit of discomfort. And sometimes it's like, oh, I fucking hate that. Sorry, am I allowed to swear? Yeah, I think I can swear. Okay. Yeah, sometimes it's like, oh, I fucking hate that. Like, I don't want to reach there. I don't want to reach out. I don't want to do that. And so we practice like going in between of like, okay, it feels safer here, but I'm going to tolerate a little bit of going out until it feels safer or better. Or maybe it's like, oh, I need to make a big shield around me so that I can feel safer. spreading out more. And so we explore that of like what feels good and safe. And so you have these like small chunks of practicing feeling safer in your body, but also tolerating discomfort and coming back to what feels safer or expanding what feels safer. And you get a lot of insight of what safety feels like. So let's say right now it feels safe to be really close to my body. I find myself like closed off or reserved, but I'm accessing a little bit of joy or a little bit of compassion for myself to like reaching out or spreading out on the page. So it's a small example of those things. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And as you're talking, the first thing you said is, I don't work with sex, but I work with pleasure.
Mm.
And I do work with sex. I'm a sex therapist as well as somatic informed therapy and drama therapy. So we're doing really similar stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I think the title of sex therapy, it's sort of, it's already in this space of like, maybe people's intentions are going to be around sexual challenges or in their relationship. Um, but it's the same. It's feeling into what feels safe and what's closed off, and then allowing those stuck and tense things to exist,
Mm-hmm.
rather than push and fight against them or try and make them go away.
Mm-hmm.
And I work with asexual people who, like, that way of relating with people doesn't, that's not their big yes.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're naming is like, it's a very inclusive way, I think, of talking about pleasure and sexuality.
Yeah. And sex comes up no matter what, because I mean, we talk about relationships, we talk about sex, we talk about like how we show up in our community and all these different, whatever it is, whether it's just walking down the street or whether it is intimate relationships with our partner or sensuality or intimacy, that all shows up no matter what. Yeah. So you can't really avoid it if you wanted
Yeah,
to.
unfortunately. No, not unfortunately, but like, it's never just that one thing, right?
Well,
It's never just sex. Challenges are usually an effect of something bigger,
yeah.
usually
And
go ahead.
yeah, how we show up in our more intimate relationships often parallels how we're showing up in many other spaces in our lives.
Yeah,
And in terms of
exactly.
consent too, like when we can say no, what our boundaries look like, how we moments where we might cross our own boundaries, like those kinds of things will show up in many areas of our life as well.
When we cross our own boundaries, yeah, that's a big one that comes up in my space, my therapy space, a lot. And I think that's what
Mhm.
we'll be digging into in the group as well, of like knowing when something feels like a no. What are the sensations of a no? And then what's,
Yeah.
usually it's a more expansive feeling of what's a yes. And then, do you go with that, or do you manipulate around it?
Yeah. And practicing embodying it, you really get into, you're like, you become more attuned to it, because sometimes we know in our bodies, we have this gut instinct of like, this doesn't feel right, but there's all these other things that we're thinking about of, I should say yes anyways, or I should do this thing anyways because it's expected of me, or I'm now in this dynamic with this other person who wants this and I don't, you know what I mean, like there's all these things that show up, that might stop us from listening to our gut feeling. But when we practice being attuned to it through these somatic practices, through our making or through drama therapy, where we like really embody it, it becomes harder to ignore. And then at the same time, we're going to learn communication around it too, like how to say it when it shows up, how we,
Hmm.
we know it's there.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's a multi-step beast.
Hmm.
I want to ask then, I think this kind of goes into the next question of, how can people who have limited access to experiencing safety
Hmm.
in relationship, or even to connection with their own feelings, safety within themselves, benefit from what we're offering?
Hmm. And I think it's important to say to name maybe what safety feels like at a given moment, because safety, like we might feel safe being really guarded like this, and that could be where we start of like, this is even if it's not where you want to be, that's what feels safe right now. And so I mean, I think the concept of safety maybe can sound very abstract because it's hard to anchor it anywhere if you don't have a lot of experience of it. So just starting with what feels safe for now. And like I said, like these, in bilateral drawing, for example, like branching out a little bit, like moving really slowly towards what you want and in a tolerable way. like being able to tolerate branching out a little bit or opening up a little bit and seeing how that feels, but knowing that you sort of naming those spaces that you're already accessing as safer spaces for you. So yeah, you definitely don't need to already have an experience of safety in a specific sense in order to benefit from our group. I think that's the point of that. We're going to move towards feelings of safety that feel aligned with what you want.
Just quick question, just really a small question here,
Yeah.
that how do systems of power interact with our bodies and dynamics with others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it came up earlier when I was saying in terms of the expectations that are on us in certain situations where we have a gut feeling, but we respond not in alignment with our gut feeling because we're existing in certain systems that place expectations on us in a certain way or place certain fears on us or anxieties on us. Yeah, I mean, like in terms of big systems, I think you had mentioned in the email, like capitalism, and then there's
Capitalism.
also capital. There's white supremacy. There's patriarchy. There's like all these things that create environments that can activate a lot of stress in us, and so we might be hyper aware of our actions in certain situations. We might be hyper aware of how we're being perceived in certain situations. We're hyper aware of how we're presenting ourselves, of what we're saying, of where we're stepping, or the way that we're moving, or our body language, or the way that we're interacting with people. So this shows up so much in, yeah, in our body and just the way that we you could be intuitively interacting with spaces in a sense. Like there's ways that we maybe want to interact with spaces, but or in our relationship. By space I mean context, relationships, whatever it is that is not in alignment with what we really want, but we're also trying to stay safe, and staying safe under these big systems is really confusing because they're invisible in a way. We don't see them in action, we feel them in action. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
What I'm hearing is around rigidity.
Mm,
So there are these narrow roles that are set up for individuals to contribute to the system of capitalism
hmm
and to keep it continuing. And that, yeah, keeps us on a very narrow but apparently safe track.
hmm
And it also separates us from our bodies. We're like, a lot of us are like floating heads because
hmm
we're thinking of like, what's the right thing to do? What's going to keep me like in a weird way of feeling like belonging
hmm
by like checking off all these boxes of how to do
hmm
relationships and how to do social and how to do family, and to come into alignment with what's really asking to be expressed. That is a big risk,
hmm
right? It's
Yeah.
scary. I've found I'm like playing with my gender these days a bit more. I'm like stepping into my masculinity, and when I go out of my little queer bubble, like I live in the village, right? When I leave that and go downtown, I feel this kind of sharpness
hmm
around me, and I don't know if it's like just I'm perceiving something or if others are kind of double, triple taking. Like, what is this? I can't comprehend this human or human adjacent creature.
Yeah, and in your case, like you said, I'm not sure if I'm just perceiving it or if it's something that's actually happening. But the fact that you're feeling different in different spaces is impacting the way that you're showing up, and it's like that is still showing up in your body and the way that you're interacting with the downtown space versus this village space. Whether or not it's perceived, but you're feeling it and you're aware of it and it's on your mind and you're thinking about it afterwards and you might be reflecting on it afterwards. It's like, how did I behave? Was that normal behavior in that situation? It comes up a lot, I notice, in folks who are thinking about different ways of being outside of like the blueprint of what's expected of us, like alternative styles of relationship or exploring their gender, exploring their sexuality, exploring kinks, and just like other ways of being with people in a more intimate way. There's a lot of stress about it. There's a lot of stress of like stepping off the beaten path and a lot of confusion. And it brings up a lot of anxieties of like, how are we supposed to be and how do I want to be?
I think this is I'm not going to rifle through my bookcase, but I want to like hold up the book cover of Sonia Renee Taylor's book, The Body is Not an Apology.
Mm-hmm.
She's a pleasure activist, and like this is her thing, is that pleasure is a radical act, body love is a radical act. You are literally upending systems by enjoying your
Mm-hmm.
your human form, and by having the sex you want, and by being in like ecstatic relationship
Yeah.
with your kin.
Yeah, and like you don't necessarily want all these actions to be political. You want to just enjoy your
Mm.
life and be
Mm.
as you are. And but yeah, there is a bit of a, I guess, this need to contemplate what feels safe in terms of like how much can you invest in that? You know what I mean? Like you have to like negotiate with yourself of like what can feel where how much are you willing to participate in, which is
Yeah.
really frustrating to have to be in that position.
Mm.
And then there's the question of like, okay, so what do you need to feel safer doing this? Which we could find, like, you know, finding community where it does feel safe, of like having the breaks that you need in order to do the things that you want to do. If it feels really overwhelming or intense, to sort of like build that blueprint that you want, what do you need to create in your environment to access safety or comfort or gentleness for yourself to make that sustainable?
Yeah, I felt just then of like talking into systems of power, I feel my chest like tightening up and going into protection. And then you're offering this really lovely question of like, what do you need to feel safe? How can you set up dynamics and frameworks that support you?
Mm-hmm.
And so a question I have is therapy enough to
Mm.
support thriving relationships?
I mean, I think therapy, at least individual therapy, it could help you a lot in terms of getting to know yourself and practicing those little bits of finding those communication tools and finding what pleasure could feel like in your body or finding compassion. I think you have to do work outside of therapy in order to practice that more. But I I do think that in therapy and one-on-one therapy, you can, I mean, of course, the therapeutic relationship is a relationship too. And a lot of things that come up for you in your personal relationships are probably showing up in your therapeutic relationship too. And so it is a space to practice in a really contained way, in a really safer way of what happens when you get triggered, for example, or what happens when you get activated and you react. So it's a place to like slow things down and stretch it out and zoom in on what's going on for you when that's happening. And so you can learn what feels good and what feels right and how to communicate around that stuff so that you can have really thriving, really fulfilling relationships that are not really triggering or really activating, in a sense, when you can hold space for the feelings that come up around it. I find sometimes when we're in like when we don't self-examine a lot and we just like act out of what's going on, acting out of our triggers and our projections and all this is coming up, we have a lot of tension in our relationships it's really hard to resolve. But when you gain insight into what's going on, then you can communicate around it and you can slow down and you can create space for those conversations in your relationships. I think boundaries are awesome also for, you know, like having thriving relationships and figuring out what feels good for you and what feels right and what you're willing to tolerate in your relationships. But yeah, I think you also need to do the work outside of outside of therapy in order to do that. Yeah. And talking about group therapy too, but I guess we'll
Hmm.
get into that. But I'm curious your thoughts on that too.
So in the therapeutic space, it is like meticulously designed and studied to be a safe enough container.
Mm-hmm.
And that the focus is very much on the client, right? And you know, we as therapists are humans and we enter the space with our whole selves, but we have that expertise to what am I trying to say? Like to channel support of that one client.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about safety so much, so they can experience what it would be like to be held in a way that's safe enough and flawed as well, but could be good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And then yeah, it is important to go out and practice in places where it kind of isn't safe, where
Mm-hmm.
people are selfish and don't listen, and where there is traffic and the world is overstimulating.
Mm-hmm.
So, but to at least know that there's a baseline of like, I can have a difficult conversation without being triggered.
Mm-hmm.
And so then be able to start to notice when it does happen out in the wild.
Yeah. And I think in therapy, you can practice a lot of self-compassion and being gentle with yourself or when it doesn't go as expected in the real world. I think that's really important to like have access to that too, because you're not just gonna be fixed when you snap your fingers and you go out and it all works as you want it to work. We wish.
What do you mean? I want my money back.
So yeah, we have to practice self-compassion, which is hard, and but it helps us navigate to the challenges of showing up in our relationships in the ways that we want, because we have to get there slowly. And yeah, being like, we're sort of talking about noticing in your body when you feel what feels good, and also like when you feel ready for something. So when somebody who hasn't dated in a really long time and they have all these feelings of like dating, and then suddenly they're dating and these things come up, but there's also, yeah, this exploration of like what does readiness feel like? How do you know when you're ready? That's a really big question, because you can also it's like impossible to say when you're necessarily ready, but yeah, practicing accessing goodness and self-compassion is really important, and we can practice that in one-on-one therapy, and in group therapy you get to practice a lot.
So much.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all these unpredictable human nervous systems around you, and you really get to feel how you impact others.
Hmm. And how you're impacted by others, and ideally in the group setting you can bring it up in gentle ways, but I think that's the other practice too, is like bringing things up in gentle ways or communicating in gentle ways when we're activated is really
Mm.
hard. And in the group context, it's sort of like everything is so zoomed in, it can be very intense, but then you have the container you have in the context of embodying desire, the group we're doing, going to be two therapists and like this container with these people who everyone's sort of examining themselves in a certain way in relationship. And that's like the really big thing that we're talking about too, is relationships and being with each other. And things are going to come up, and we might notice certain things come up in ourselves related to another person in the group, let's say. And so you have this space to explore it, to process it, whether or not you say it out loud, but just the process of getting in touch with that or attuning to that yourself and like holding it.
And people might surprise you.
Mm-hmm.
There might be someone who really reminds you of that other person that you just can't stand. And then how long can you tolerate that for? Can you tolerate it for another 10 minutes just to see if there is some new response to an old situation? Can there be curiosity in these dynamics with others, that like what are they trying to tell you? What are you noticing that's maybe happening over and over?
Mm-hmm. I think curiosity is the big word too. It's like the most important thing, to be curious and be aware of your assumptions, but be curious of, this person showing up and noticing. Be curious about yourself too, like sort of maybe noticing what's coming up for you, but being curious about it rather than trying to interpret it right away or trying to attach to it, but instead practicing being curious, like, okay, I feel super tense around this person. What's going on for me? Like maybe less about like what's wrong with that person, but what's going on for me? Why is this showing up in my body? Why am I feeling tense? So there'll be a lot of space for that, of being curious with yourself, being curious with other people.
And also to zoom it out to like the beauty of a group, it's people who are drawn towards exploring the same topic, who are coming in with such rich life experience that, yeah, coming to be with the wisdom of that collective knowledge. And in a one-on-one, there's like this one person with this like background in the human state, and then you get this treasure trove of lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it a privilege to create space where there's that openness to share
Mm-hmm.
that wisdom.
Yeah. And it's so, yeah, like you said, people can surprise you. And it's surprising. Sometimes I find in groups, at least the groups I've done, like you don't expect how much in common people are going to have, or suddenly you're like, oh my God, everyone in this room has this one thing that they do really similarly, or that they is really similar to their identity that they relate to. And then there's this specific dynamic in the group that we couldn't have anticipated either, of the threads that people share within each other. Yeah. It's really nice.
Let's plug that group.
Yeah.
We were talking about this group. What's going on?
You want me to plug it?
Yeah. Tell us
Okay.
the details.
Me and Susie are facilitating Embodying Desire, which is going to be a somatic creative arts therapies group series with a very intimate group of maximum 8 people, where we're going to have the chance to explore our reactions or our responses or our embodied experiences in response to a lot of topics like sexuality, gender identity, relationship identities, spectrums of kink and fetish, and taboo subjects like STIs, things like that, intimacy in relationships, sensuality, all this consent, all these things that like bring up a lot in the body or a lot of reactions. We're going to have the space to explore that through creative arts therapies, through art therapy, through drama therapy techniques, through somatic techniques, in a group context, and have that space together.
And it's starting November 3rd.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be meeting on Sunday afternoons, in person only, down in the plateau in Jojage in Montreal. And there will be a link to the page with more details in the show notes. So if you are listening to this when it goes off live or in the next week, because we have registration is open just till the 18th, and then we got to close it up.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only 3 spaces left. So if this is like, if something is sparking or buzzing inside you from anything we've been talking about, just see what you like in the page. And we're both here for any of your questions about joining.
Mm-hmm. And we didn't mention it's mostly a queer space. I think at this point, all of the participants are in the LGBTQIASSI2 plus community. Yeah, and so my feelings about it was like the reason I approached you about doing this, because I was listening to a podcast on queer sex education, and I was like, oh my God, I wish I had that, and I feel like I would love to do something about creating it. And so I reached out to Susie because they're a sex therapist and drama therapist, and I was like, we could do this together and do it in a somatic way and explore creating together the queer sex education that we never got. And that's really what I wanted to. So I think there's like stuff for both of us too, that we like our own needs that we wanted to explore through this. And that's the reason that we're facilitating this, because it feels like a big gap in what's available out there, especially in a group setting.
Yeah, people really want to talk about sex.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of interest. I'm really excited.
Thanks again to Dani for sharing her wealth of knowledge and her compassion. You can find out more about her work as an art therapist through her website, which I've posted in the show notes. I really got a lot out of today's conversation, and I hope you did too. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, it would mean a lot if you could give us a 5-star review. I say us, it is literally me, Susie Showers, here in my home office. This is a very DIY and organic project, so even small actions like a like or a share can help it to grow and spread the wisdom of these amazing guests to reach more ears. Thanks so much.